Away from that now, President Vladimir Putin has told a summit with African leaders in St. Petersburg that Russia is able to replace Ukrainian grain exports to Africa, and Moscow will be ready to start supplying grain for free to 6 African countries within 3 to 4 months. This comes as President Putin named the 6 African countries as Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Central African Republic, and Eritrea. Similarly, Russia says it will organize a competition next year for members of the BRICS alliance, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Speaking at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, Russian Sports Minister Oleg Matistin said athletes from the countries would be invited to participate in the event in the Russian city of Kazan in June. Moscow's war in Ukraine and its exit from a UN-brokered grain deal has been highlighted to loom over this week's Russia-Africa Summit as President Vladimir Putin tries to woo African leaders seeking economic relief amid signs the Kremlin may be ready to seriously address peace talks with Kiev. Joining me now to speak more on the Russia-Africa Summit taking place in St. Petersburg is Global Affairs Analyst Joshua Onyenwere. Thank you for joining us on The World Now. The second Russia-Africa Summit is on, and President Putin is making some serious promises there, promising to replace Ukraine with a supply of grain and getting the grain across to about 6 African countries within 3 to 4 months. What do you make of this at this time?
Well, in my opinion, I think what is critical here is that in the world of global politics, we are seeing big changes. We are seeing big changes in the power balance between Russia and Western countries. So events like the Russia-Africa Summit and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is playing a big role, in these changes. So when we look at Russia, the nation is undeniably strong because of her military and her influence in Africa through the trade agreement. But it is starting to face challenges because of the problems, with the Western nations. So due to the conflict, also due to the conflict in Ukraine. But what we can take out from this is that the power balance, between Russia and Western countries, as well as African nations, is beginning to change. And African nations this summit provides that opportunity for Africans to, play a big role in global diplomacy.
What demand would you say that these African countries should actually place on the table? Because apparently now they are like the bride that every part of the world is trying to woo.
Exactly. That's true. Well, from what we can see, the African leaders are likely to seek assurances from Putin regarding the continuity of the grain supplies, particularly in light of the recent spike in global wheat prices following Russia's withdrawal from the grain deal. So in simple terms, we can expect discussions at the summit to revolve around the assurances and the development of new framework. And this framework should be able to address the supplies that Putin has promised, as well as address Putin's concern, because Putin is saying that the Western nations have taken advantage of the grain deal, and this is at the disadvantage of developing nations, especially African nations.
As it is now, all of this is happening, we can say, at the expense of Ukraine, because, of course, the war there is still raging. Do you see this place some kind of moral burden on these African countries who should in some way also be looking for ways to intervene and find peace in the troubled country?
Yes, you are very right with that. But, it is clear that Africa's action in this situation, and especially in the current global politics, are shaped by Africa's past, particularly the Western, colonial impact on African nation. So Africa's position, becomes clearer due to Africa's resources, particularly in consuming Russia's grain. But it's more of a carrot and stick approach where Putin has a leverage, especially if the African nations want to get away from the current food inflation that that has besieged a lot of African nations. I mean, Nigeria, especially where the president declared the food crisis. So it's a carrot and stick. Putin is using this to his advantage, bringing the African nations to him, and wooing the African nations to take his side. But the reality is that African nations have to now decide where they belong, and it's a game of diplomacy in this instance.
And those countries have been strategically selected, cutting across West, South, East, and Central Africa. I must sincerely appreciate you, Joshua Onyenwere, for talking to us on The World Now.
Thank you very much for having me.